The Reconstruction Era, Rebuilding the South, Voting Access and Rights.
After the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in 1865, the Radical Republicans began to push harder than ever before. The Radical Republicans believed that all former slaves should be allowed to have the same rights as the white people. Also, in their opinion, Confederate officials from the Civil War should be punished. Many people believed that the federal government was getting too involved with individual state governments, but the Radicals thought that there needed to be more control within the states. So they pushed for President Andrew Johnson to approve the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, as well as the Civil Rights Bill. Johnson opposed both, and many Republicans were stunned by Johnson's racism and joined the Radicals in support of the approval of these bills. Even though the Radicals did their best for former slaves to have the same rights as whites, groups like the Ku Klux Klan terrified the black people. So, along with many barriers put before former slaves and the right to vote, they were also scared away from the polls by these different groups.
Between the 1890s to the 1960s, many state governments in the southern United States administered literacy tests to prospective voters purposely to test their literacy in order to vote. In practice, these tests were intended to disenfranchise racial minorities. Southern state legislatures employed literacy tests as part of the voter registration process starting in the late 19th century. Literacy tests, along with poll taxes and extra legal intimidation, were used to deny suffrage to African Americans. The first formal voter literacy tests were introduced in 1890. At first, whites were generally exempt from the literacy test if they could meet alternate requirements like the grandfather clause. That, in practice, excluded the blacks.
The 14th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified on July 9, 1868, and granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, which included former slaves recently freed. In addition, it forbids states from denying any person's life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or to deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. By directly mentioning the role of the states, the 14th Amendment greatly expanded the protection of civil rights to all Americans and is cited in more litigation than any other amendment. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution granted African American men the right to vote by declaring that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Although ratified on February 3, 1870, the promise of the 15th Amendment would not be fully realized for almost a century. Through the use of poll taxes, literacy tests, and other means, southern states were able to effectively disenfranchise African Americans. It would take the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 before the majority of African Americans in the South were registered to vote.
A grandfather clause is a provision in which an old rule continues to apply to some existing situations while a new rule will apply to all future cases. Those exempt from the new rule are said to have grandfather rights or acquired rights. Frequently, the exemption is limited. It may extend for a set time, or it may be lost under certain circumstances. The term originated in late 19th century legislation and constitutional amendments passed by a number of U.S. southern states, which created new requirements for literacy tests, payment of poll taxes, and/or residency and property state from such requirements. The intent and effect of such rules was to prevent poor and illiterate African Americans, former slaves, and their descendants from voting, but without denying poor and illiterate whites the right to vote. Jim Crow laws were state and local laws enforcing racial segregation in the southern United States. Enacted after the Reconstruction period, these laws continued in force until 1995.